Okay, we were discussing Locke. So in the last class, we discussed about uh, what is moral conduct according to Locke. Okay, what is the idea of freedom and free will? I hope all those ideas are clear with you. Uh, so as we discussed, today we are going to look at the three different kinds of laws that Locke talks about. So he essentially talks about three different kinds of laws, and for such things to be called laws, there are certain aspects of it that have to be there. Okay, so what are those? So let's look at the three different kinds of laws that he talks about. So just the way Aquinas also talks about hierarchy of laws, so does Locke. So Locke says that the first kind of law that he is referring to is the natural laws which are given by God, laws which are product of God's will. Okay, so and that will of God is manifest in the natural law. Okay, and just like Aquinas is also says that uh, uh, you know the divine revelations, okay, are also part of the same law. Okay, it's the same law because revelations in different scriptures are also will of God, and the same is sanctioned by pleasure and pain. So if you do the right thing, there'll be good consequences. The sense of the word that he's using here is pleasure. So pleasure gives you direction as to what's the right thing to do. But then if you remember in the last class we discussed that it's not referring to the immediate pleasure. Okay, if you are thinking about immediate pleasure, you do not suspend your action and think about the outcomes of your action, then in the long run it might give you more pain. So that has to be there, and that's the idea of free will that we discussed in the last class. So yes, here he's saying that the first kind of law is the natural law, which is an outcome of will of God. Okay, which is the will of God, and it comes with some kind of sanctions, and sanctions are pleasure and pain. Okay, but then not just immediate pleasure, not just immediate pain, you also have to think about what's the outcome, what's the kind of pleasure that you get in the future. So all those things matter. But then we also remember that he's not talking about pleasure and pain from a utilitarian perspective, because at the end of the day, pleasure and pain reveals to us what God has already laid down. So it's not really based on the consequence. Okay, the consequences tell you, if you do the right sort of calculation, applying your reason, what the God has already laid down. That is the natural law. So yes, the first kind of law is the natural law, which is will of God, sanctioned by pleasure and pain. The second kind of law that he's talking about is civil law. Okay, now because natural law does not lay down every all different ways in which it might be applicable in our lives clearly. Okay, so there might be here and there some kind of cases, specific cases in which those gaps left by natural law have to be fulfilled. So that is fulfilled by the second kind of law, civil law. So civil law has to be always in accordance with the natural law. It cannot be in derogation or violation of the natural law. So what are civil laws? Laws which are made here. Okay, so laws which are made here and enforced, like on this planet, on this earth. Okay, in the civil society that we live in. Okay, so which are enforced by or of the Commonwealth, through three different kinds of sanctions. Okay, what are those? Those are, it can take away your life, it can take away your liberty, it can take away your property. So that's the second kind of law, laws that concern us here on this earth in those civil societies that we live in. Okay, and those are enforced by the power of the Commonwealth. Okay, how? By taking away your life, liberty, and property. So these laws, as you remember, have to be in consonance with the higher law. Okay, this cannot be in derogation of the higher law. That is the will of God that tells us what natural law is. And then ultimately there is another kind of law, okay, that he calls rules of fashion. So what is acceptable in a group or a community. Okay, so those are called rules of fashion. So the way you ought to behave, the way you ought to talk, and etc., etc. Okay, so what kind of sanction do you get there? So it could be private censure. Okay, so these are those, to which humans compare their actions to, whether my actions are in fulfillment of those expectations or not. Okay, and then if you do not, then what's the outcome? You will get some kind of social disapproval. Your behavior, your act will not be liked by the community. So yeah, there will be social disapproval of the same. So yes, the third kind of rule is the rules of fashion, also known as private censure, because it's part of a smaller group that we are referring to, where certain acts or behaviors are acceptable or not. So yes, and the third kind of law is sanctioned by social disapproval. Now, Locke calls all these different kinds of laws as laws. Okay, they are all laws. Okay, in different ways. But what is essential in all these three different kinds of laws is that, okay, there is a law. Okay, the law, and then there is a consequence, that is the punishment, and there is a power, existence of power, because without power here, punishment cannot be there. Okay, so even in the third kind, the power would probably be that in a group your actions are disapproved, so there is a power relationship. Okay, so yes, if these three different elements, that is that has to be there. Okay, so there is a law, there has to be a punishment, which is inherent to the idea of law, as we discussed, and of course there is a power relation, because see, look at from the first kind of laws that we looked at. God, okay, God is in a superior position, and that's why he's able to exercise his will to give us laws. So that's the power relation. Okay, in case of civil law, the Commonwealth has the power to take away your life, liberty, property. So that's the power relation. And in the third case, the case of social disapproval. So that's the power relation. So these three elements are present in all these three different kinds of laws. Okay, so yes. Yes, this ultimately the idea is that all these laws have to take us to something called the greatest happiness. Okay, not in a utilitarian way. Okay, the greatest happiness is something that you achieve by virtue of following the the natural law. That's the idea that he's talking about. Okay. Now, another problem that arises here is that what happens if people disagree. Okay, he was talking about that earlier. We discussed about empiricism. Okay, how we apply our mind to the world which has been created by the God. Okay, through our experiences, through our sensory perception. When we apply our reason to the sensory perception, we come to the right conclusion about what is right and what is wrong. Okay, so the question is, what if we come to different conclusion, and it is true, it's a fact that people do in fact come to different conclusions about what is right and what is wrong, and in those situations, how do we account for them? How do we explain that? Okay, so that's something that's very essential to us. Okay, now here's where he says that this moral truth that we were referring to would not be based on merely utility, because if it were all about utility, it would be basically me thinking about only myself. Okay, and trying to aggrandize my own benefit, my own utility, and everyone else would think about their own benefit. Okay, so of course in such case no one will come to right conclusion about what's the right thing to do as he understood. So the principle that we discussed cannot be based on utility, because it will take us to completely different conclusions, because we are all kind of self-centered, aren't we? So yes, we were talking about pleasure and pain nonetheless. So those pleasure and pain only takes you towards the God's will. Okay, so the rightness of your action has to be its conformity with that of God's will, because God's will is objective, universal. If you just experience things around you and apply the right reasoning, okay, apply all your faculties, apply the right reasoning, and then you will come to right conclusion about what God has willed, okay. And God has willed one thing about a situation, okay. So you will come to that conclusion if you merely care to apply your faculties, okay. And that cannot be based on utility, okay. Arriving at that conclusion will not be based on utility, because utility will take you to different conclusions. So that's what he essentially says, that yes, there is objectivity to the kind of legal reasoning, the moral reasoning that Locke is talking about, okay. So Locke does not recognize moral diversity. There is one moral truth in specific situation, okay. So he almost equates it with mathematical demonstrations, okay, that just how you can mathematically demonstrate the order of the universe, okay. In the same way, you can also come to conclusions about what is morally right and morally wrong, and there is no question of you, me, and someone here and there coming to a different conclusion. But then he has to tell us, why does it happen, okay. Why does these differences then happen? He says that the differences are not because of the intelligent response, but it's because of different kind of stimuli to a particular reaction, okay. So he says that once you have experienced the things the same way, then your reasoning, your intelligent response will lead you to the same outcome, okay. We all will concur on the morality of our actions, okay. But then it could be that the reaction to the stimuli through our sensory perceptions are different. But then if that is the case, to what extent can we blame the person for getting different stimuli, okay. Is it a flaw in the design, or is it something else? That's the thing that we need to ponder upon in greater detail. Now, yes, so that's what he says, okay, that if at all the diversity arises, that's not because of the intelligent response, okay, which will be the same in the light of the facts that we, in the light of the experience, okay. But the diversity arises because of a different reaction to the stimuli, okay. And also because sometimes we if you remember, the earlier we said that sometimes you have to suspend your immediate pleasure for the sake of something that's good in the future, that's pleasurable in the future, okay. So yes, these are the two things that you will need to keep in mind, okay. And if you do, then you will come to right conclusion about what is the right moral conduct, what is the law of nature or natural law. So, and that natural law will be binding on all, doesn't matter when and does not matter what circumstances. So time and circumstances will not change the applicability of or the validity of the natural law, okay. So what he is essentially saying is that yes, circumstances might require us to behave in a certain way, in different ways, but then the natural law in this binding force remains the same, in the sense that, for example, someone who is trying to kill you, and you might have to hit the person back or even kill that person in your defense. So when you do that, there is still some kind of violation of the natural law, but the circumstances require that you do, because you also have to protect your own self, okay. So yes, the circumstances require our vary our duties, okay. No circumstances basically vary the way in which we react, but then the requirement of the duties under the natural law remains the same. So he says that the binding force of laws of nature are perpetual, it never changes, okay. It doesn't matter which time and circumstances, but our requirements of our duties may vary because of changing circumstances, okay, but the law remains binding, okay. So that's the thing. So I hope this much is clear, okay. So at the end of the day, just remember that if we were to determine what is the right action, okay, based on whether it is based on utilitarian principle, then it will only lead us to what is convenient and good for us, okay. Then there will be no moral objectivity. Whereas Locke will not agree to that. Locke will not accept that. He says that yes, what is right conduct cannot be based on our convenience. Then there'll be disagreements. It has to be one, and God has willed something, and that's one. Okay, so if you apply his principle, okay, then you will come to right conclusion about, if you do the right calculation and if you apply your reasoning capacity, then you will come to right conclusion about what is the right thing to do. So that's essentially what Locke has to say about natural law. We can take it further, but I think we need to stop somewhere. I have shared other readings, so you guys go through that. Let's now proceed to another important aspect of his work, okay, especially in the second treatise, okay, where he's talking about rights, okay, and more specifically, you keep asking me about natural rights, okay, and what is the relation between natural law and natural rights. And that's a little difficult question to answer, in the sense that earlier when you asked that what is natural right, I told you that natural right is what follows from the natural law itself, in the sense that natural law lays down certain duties, certain ways in which you need to function. Okay, so corollary to that, if it belongs to someone else, will be the natural right that that person has. That's one way of explaining that. Okay, what natural rights is all about. But then it tells us that somehow natural rights, okay, are subordinate to natural law. Okay, there is another way of talking about natural rights. That will be that we all have certain rights, and rights are more important than the other duties which are there. Okay, so there is this conflict between these two different approaches. Okay, so some interpret it in terms of rights. So mostly the libertarians would talk in terms of rights. Okay, they would focus less on the duty aspect of it. Whereas there are others who say that yes, you do have natural rights, but they are also to be blamed as against certain duties that you have. Okay, an example being, how much property can I keep? Okay, you may say that I have right to property. Right to what? To what extent do you have right to property? Can you own the entire world to the exclusion of everyone else? Can you say that you have a natural right of that sort? Or would your rights, okay, also be limited by certain duties that you might have? So this sort of questions quite often arise. So if you have a property, you can use it in whatsoever way you want. You are a small scale sovereign with respect to that property, if you're talking about property rights in the absolute sense of the term. Yes, but then there are certain can the state impose certain limitations on the way I can use my property? Okay, can there be certain duties imposed on me? So if that's the case, then we are saying that our rights are also subordinate to certain other duties. So this is where the problem arises. Okay, so so we do not have any conclusive answer to what Locke has to say about this matter, in the sense that different authors have interpreted this matter differently, and I have shared one reading with you guys. Kindly go through that, you'll find that. So yes, that's the case, but we all know that Locke talks about natural rights, certain rights which are inalienable from us, in the sense that it cannot be taken away by anyone, okay, arbitrarily there. So yes, those are of those rights that I'm talking about is of great importance to us. Okay, and those rights we get by virtue of being humans, and these are the natural rights, okay, that Locke refers to. So Locke in his second treatise says that being all equal and independent, if you remember I talked about equality, liberty, etc. earlier. He says being all equal because we are all God's creations, okay, as much as I am as much a God's creation as the Prime Minister of this country, or the President of the United States, or Bill Gates, or whosoever, and the beggar on the street, okay, and the one who's condemned in the jails, etc. Everyone's creation of the same God. So we are all equal, being God's creation. Okay, so he says being all equal and independent. Okay, we are not serfs of anyone. Okay, we are not slaves of anyone. We all are equal and independent. So he says no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, and possessions. Okay, so because we are God's creation, we are all equal and independent. This is about us, what cannot be harmed. Okay, what are those? Our life cannot be harmed. Okay, our health cannot be harmed, our liberty cannot be harmed, and our possessions cannot be harmed. So in short, we talk about life, liberty, property, if you remember. So these are our natural rights. Okay, this is what we have even in the state of nature, not just in the civil society that we have entered into by virtue of the contract. Okay, even in the state of nature we have these rights. Okay, he's not saying that those rights are not infringed. He's not saying that. It's very much possible, but then by virtue of being born human, you have these rights. Okay, right to your life, health, liberty, possession, in short, life, liberty, property. So yes, this is what Locke calls as natural rights. So he says every man has right to command himself and the resources that he needs to preserve himself. And why does he say so? God has created us. Now we are to sustain ourselves in this world. Okay, and because we are God's creation and not the creation of any other human beings. Okay, so only God will have command over me. Okay, apart from God, I have command over myself and no one else. Okay, so that's very important, that no one else can have command over you, not even group, not even a large group, not even the state, unless you subject or consent to being commanded. In a certain, we'll come to that later. So it has to be based on consent. So he says every man has a right to command himself. Okay, because you are not creation of anyone else. Okay, and the resources that he needs to preserve himself. So it's not just yourself, you are also an alive being. Okay, so and being alive requires resources. Okay, so you also have to command yourself to certain resources to not just stay alive but also preserve yourself. Okay, so that will be your natural right. So yes, life is there, your life is definitely there. Liberties, because you have to exercise your liberties, and property. Okay, now what's the limit of that property? We are not discussing that yet. I think it's better left for the next semester. So he further says access to laws of nature, okay, enables men to live together and free. Okay, together and free, to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other person. Now here's a little bit of contradictory part that you see. Okay, it says that access to the laws of nature, so the nature, the natural law that creates duties for you, so that enables man to live together and free. That's very important, because we are not just isolated, island like individuals. We have to live together, and living together requires compromises here and there. Okay, so that's very essential. Now how do we balance between our absolute rights, that seems to be the case in case of natural rights, with that of duty? So he says to order their actions. So he definitely talks about how to optimize your actions. Okay, order your action, and how to dispose of their possession and persons as they think fit. So he's also talking about liberties, okay, and property, so that you do not need permission from someone. Okay, or depending upon the will of any other man. So here's a struggle between a duty that you have and also the freedom, the liberty that you have. Okay. So yes, what we have seen so far is that those who think in terms of absolute rights will take particular portion of Locke's philosophy, interpret in a certain way to justify absolute property, etc., etc. And then there are others who would find out other aspect of his philosophy and then say that he's definitely not talking about property in the absolute sense of the term, in which there is no restraint. Okay, and that question of distribution should only be left to what one wants to, to the charity of a person. Okay, and that there could be sometimes some restriction imposed upon what you can possess and own for the betterment of others. So you have this contrasting interpretation of things. But then this is what Locke has to sort of say about, talk about. So he now that's the law of nature. So even in the state of nature, as you know, that he's not creating the same kind of dark, bleak, gloomy state of nature as Hobbes was talking about. We discussed Hobbes was a child of fear. So he had that to talk about in the state of nature. That only reason for you, for which you come into the subjection of sovereign is for for the sake of peace. That's it, very earthly peace. But here he's saying that no, that's not the case. We already had these rights in the state of nature, and those are your natural rights. So when you enter into a community, you do not give up those rights. You enter into that community for the protection of those rights. So he says that even in the state of nature, you have a right to punish anyone who transgresses your natural rights. So if anyone transgresses the law of nature, everyone else will have the power to right to punish the transgressor. So that's an executive power that everyone has. But the problem is that we might use it in a wrong way. Now, yes, a punishment, as we discussed earlier, is an inherent part of the idea of natural law. So that's why he's talking about this. Your natural law talks about some certain things, and if anyone transgresses the natural law, everyone will have the power to punish the transgressor, and that's what makes it the law. Now, one question that remains is what kind of punishment? What is the degree of that punishment? So now there are conflicting accounts of what degree and what kind of punishment is to be imposed. In some places he says that it has to be of such a nature as to make it an ill bargain for the person who's the transgressor. If that is the case, it is clearly a case of deterrence. So that someone does not do it in future. So set an example. So as to prevent, proscribe, and deter others from committing the same. At other places, he talks about commensurability between the action which has been committed and the kind of punishment which is to be imposed, and that seems to be a case of retribution to the extent that a wrong has been committed. So we're not quite sure what he's talking about, but one thing we are quite sure is that punishment has to be there, because punishment is inherent to the idea of law, and that's what makes it law. So it is probably to serve both as a kind of you provide reparation to the party, as well as do not go overboard with punishing. But then he also says that sometimes you might need to set an example. So we do not have clarity as to that. Now that's the idea of punishment. Now the question is, why can't we stay in this stage, where everyone is in the state of nature and everyone has the power to punish others? Why can't we stay in that situation? There has to be some reason that it is not enough, that we need to enter into a social contract. So regarding the state of nature, he says that state of nature is a state of liberty, in the sense that liberty in a kind of restricted sense. So he says that state of nature is a state of liberty, not of license. In a state of license, you do absolutely whatever you want to do. You also curtail others' liberty. You also transgress upon others' rights. You also break the natural law. So he's saying that state of nature is a state of liberty, but not of license. So in the community of nature, this is what it used to be, but then that is not sufficient. There is some problem with that. So we enter into a civil society. Now the civil society is the outcome of the social contract that he talks about. But then natural law is not an outcome of that social contract. Natural law is basically what the God has commanded. So the civil society that we create, is for the sake of creating a neutral arbiter who will punish the transgression. That cannot be you and I, because we can be driven by self-interest. But if we have a neutral arbiter, that being will be in best capacity to punish the transgressor. Okay, so that's the reason for entering into a civil society. So he says civil society differs from state of nature only in its power to punish transgressions of the law of nature more systematically and effectively. Okay, otherwise nothing changes. Your natural rights and the natural law remains the same. You still have the same natural rights that we discussed, and you are still under the command of the same natural law that we discussed. So the laws that will govern you in the civil society cannot be in derogation of that. Okay, that's why he says that civil society differs from state of nature, not completely, only, okay, only in its power to punish transgressions. Okay, otherwise we will all do it on our own. Okay, that will lead to problems. Okay, so he says that it differs from the state of nature only in its power to punish transgressions of the law of nature in a more systematic and effective manner. Okay, so if it is left to individuals or small groups, that will not be systematic and it may not be effective, because everyone might be willing to exercise their own power, and that's not what we want. Okay, so we create a mechanism that essentially enforces those higher laws. That's what, and that mechanism, that civil society that you create, cannot violate those natural laws and natural rights. Okay, so he creates this doctrine, okay, strange doctrine as has been called, okay, that everyone has the executive power of law of nature. So earlier, before you enter into the society, everyone had the power to punish. Okay, but because of its defects, okay, because of the defects that we have discussed, okay, uh, it compels us to leave the state of nature and enter into a civil society. Okay, now whose mistake is this? It could be at the level of individuals. Okay, quite often individuals are driven by their own self-interest, and it could also be, collective failure. Okay, so that's why it cannot be left to either individuals or to a group either. So it has to be done by a neutral arbiter. Okay, so you need to create an indifferent judge, okay, judge who's not biased by his or her situation. Okay, so for that reason, for the sake of creation of that independent judge, we enter into a civil society. Okay, so the reason is that not everyone can be a judge and an executioner. Okay, we need to have a neutral, indifferent, okay, known judge. Okay, if you remember, we had discussed this earlier as well. So there is a need for a known, okay, not someone who's to be identified in specific cases, but this is a known judge who's indifferent judge as well. Okay, and that judge will have the authority to determine the differences, all the differences, disputes according to established law. So that's the kind of idea of rule of law that he had talked about. But this is not rule of law in the positivist sense of the term, in the sense that this law that we are referring to has to be in consonance with the higher law. Okay, for this reason, for the sake of creation of this indifferent judge, okay, we humans leave our natural community. Okay, we leave from the state of nature. Okay, and establish this indifferent judge. Okay, and in doing so, we surrender our right to punish others. If you remember, we had this power in the state of nature to punish others for transgression of natural law, but now we give that power up and surrender it to the indifferent judge, who will have the legitimate right to punish. Okay, so yes, now what happens is that we were already in a community. It's not that we were not in a community. Now we make another positive agreement. Okay, and by virtue of that larger community that we had, okay, which is little administratively unmanageable, okay, we break down into small divided communities, divided associations, and that's the civil society that he is referring to. Okay, so yes, that civil society that we create will have a neutral judge, arbiter, who's indifferent to the matters, and will decide the matter in an arbitrary, not in a neutral way, in a non-arbitrary way. So that's the idea of civil society. And the laws which are created in the civil society, okay, are the civil laws, okay, that we discussed earlier. And those civil laws have to be in agreement, cannot be in derogation of the law of nature. Okay, if it is, then that gives you reason to revolt against the civil society that we're talking about. Okay, so law of nature is nothing but civil law writ large. Okay, so it's the same law, okay, which is writ large, and the civil laws have to be in consonance with the laws of nature. Okay, so as we discussed a little while ago, that laws of nature is not that detailed. Okay, it leaves gaps here and there. Okay, so civil law merely fills in the details, okay, which are missing in the natural law. Okay, and thus provides a just and effective way of punishing the transgressors. Okay, so civil law exists only for the sake of punishing the transgressors, those who transgress the natural law. So yes, civil law, he says, that is not for is for those, okay, civil, so the idea is that, yeah, we had discussed earlier that if we observe the world around us, okay, properly, and then apply the right reasoning, okay, our reasoning capacity will come to the right conclusion. But not everyone is capable of doing that. Okay, so civil law comes as an assistance for that, because natural law is not written down anywhere, but civil law is. So civil law is essentially for those who are not capable of understanding the natural law quite clearly enough on their own. Okay, so yes, that's the relation between civil law and natural law, that civil law cannot be in derogance of the natural law. Okay, now your obligation to obey the law is obey the civil law depends on the rightness of the civil law, in the sense that the extent to which it is in agreement with the natural law. Okay, so that's essentially what Locke has to say about natural law. And I'm not going into the contract and consent part in great detail, because I guess that's left to the political sciences course, and otherwise we go on forever with this topic itself. So that's essentially what Locke's idea of natural law. In short, it is that natural law is essentially the divine will, the divine command. God, being in a higher superior position to you, is able to command you into doing and abstaining from doing something. Okay, and how do we come to know of it? Yes, you will come to know of it if you through your experience of the world. Okay, as your sensory perception tells you, and when you apply your reasoning to what you perceive, you will come to know of what is natural law. And yes, pleasure and pain are the guides that you have in telling you what is the right thing to do. But sometimes you do not give in to the immediate pain and pleasure. Okay, but you also might have to suspend it and then see what is the long-term outcome of it. But when I say that, I'm not talking about it in the utilitarian sense of the term, as Locke says, but in the sense that it only tells you what is already laid down by God. So yes, that's the idea of natural law that Locke talks about. And the civil laws, which are merely for the punishment of transgressors, okay, of the natural law, and creation of a neutral arbiter, okay, neutral judge, okay, that civil law has to be in consonance with the laws of nature. And that's essentially the relation between municipal law and the natural law. It's essentially to protect your natural rights as well. So that's why, if we remember, we talked about the idea of constitutionalism, limited government. That idea comes from this, that government cannot take away what you had in the state of nature. Okay, government's justification is only to the extent that it protects what you already had in the state of nature, your natural rights. So it cannot take that away. But I'm not conveying much here though. So does it say government is in no way justified in interfering, or could there be certain situation when it is justified for the government to interfere? So that we are going to discuss in the next semester when we talk about Locke's theory of property in greater detail. So with that, we conclude our discussion for today. If you guys have any confusions, clarifications, you guys feel free to leave your comment below in the Google Classroom. So thank you. Good day.